The hike had been going well. It was one of those cool mornings in late October, the air crisp, and a soft fog still hanging in the woods as I made my way up the trail. The leaves underfoot were a mix of yellow and orange, a clear sign that fall was in full swing. I had taken the weekend off to get away from everything, away from the city, the noise, the stress. The forest was the perfect place to clear my head. I had spent years hiking in the woods, so I knew the area pretty well, or at least I thought I did. It was a little over an hour into my hike when I first noticed something was off. The quiet felt too still, almost too perfect. The usual sounds of birds and rustling animals were missing. It wasn't complete silence, but it was close, unnaturally close. I stopped for a moment, checking my watch. It was 9:45 a.m. The sun was up, but the fog still hadn't lifted. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the usual fog that lingered in this part of the forest. Still, a sense of unease settled in my chest, but I continued walking, telling myself it was nothing. The trail narrowed as I moved further into the woods, and I had to step carefully over rocks and fallen branches. The woods here were dense, thick with pines and the occasional oak. The trail wasn't a well-trodden one, but it was clearly marked with yellow paint on the trees, so it wasn't easy to get lost. I had done this hike multiple times before, so I didn't feel any real fear. Still, there was this strange feeling that I couldn't shake, like I was being watched. I pushed on, convincing myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The fog began to clear a little as I reached a small clearing where I planned to take a break. I sat on a large rock, pulling out my water bottle and a protein bar. My phone, of course, had no signal, which didn't bother me much. I wasn't here for a connection to the world, just for the peace and quiet. As I sat there, eating and taking in the stillness of the woods, I couldn't help but feel like the air was thick, heavier than usual. It felt like something was pressing down on me, a weight that I couldn't escape. I stood up quickly, brushing the dirt off my pants, and glanced around. That's when I saw it. First, I thought it was a deer. I had seen plenty of wildlife in these woods before, but this figure was too still and its posture was off. It was crouched behind a cluster of bushes, just barely visible. The figure was tall, taller than any deer I had ever seen. Its body hunched almost too much so. I froze, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The creature's head turned slightly, just enough that I could see its face. But it wasn't a face, not like any face I had ever seen. Its eyes were too wide, too black, and its skin was stretched tight over its bones, as though it didn't belong to any animal I recognized. I slowly backed away, not taking my eyes off the thing. My breath hitched in my throat, and my heart began to race. The figure didn't move at first. It stayed crouched, watching me with those black eyes. I could feel the blood pounding in my ears. I had no idea what it was, but I knew I had to get away. I turned and started to walk backward, slowly at first, then quicker as panic set in. The air felt even heavier now, as though the forest itself was pressing in on me, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. That's when I heard it, the crunch of leaves behind me. My heart stopped. The figure had moved. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just trees, just the fog. I blinked hard, trying to make sense of what was happening. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was some trick of the fog or the light. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I started to walk faster, keeping my eyes peeled for any movement in the trees. The sense of being watched grew stronger with every step I took. The silence was oppressive now, the stillness almost unbearable. The path was more difficult to follow as I tried to move faster. My steps hurried but careful. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure standing behind me, but nothing. The forest seemed empty, silent, but it wasn't right. It didn't feel right. I heard the crunch of leaves again, but this time it was closer, too close. I whipped my head around and saw a shadow dart between two trees, too fast for my mind to fully process. I froze, my breath shallow, my body trembling. I knew I wasn't alone, but it felt like the woods had come alive around me. I started walking again, quicker this time, but still as quietly as I could manage. The path was growing more difficult to navigate, branches scratching at my arms, roots trying to trip me. I wasn't sure if it was the fear or the fog, but I couldn't get my bearings anymore. Everything seemed off. I reached another clearing, but this one felt different, almost wrong. The air was thick, heavy, like the world itself was holding its breath. There were no birds, no wind, no sound, just the quiet. I stood there, trying to listen for anything, but there was nothing. And then I saw it again, the figure. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, just watching me. This time, it was more visible, and I could see its features more clearly. It was tall, hunched, its skin stretched tight over its body. Its face, it was like nothing human, and yet it almost looked human. The eyes were too big, too black, and there was a strange, almost unnatural stillness to its presence. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I wasn't supposed to be here. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. I turned to run, but something stopped me. A voice, no, not a voice, more like a thought, an instinct told me to look back, and so I did. The figure was no longer standing at the edge of the clearing. It was right behind me. I didn't think, I just ran. I sprinted through the forest, my legs burning, my lungs on fire, but I didn't stop, couldn't. Behind me, the sound of something following, moving with unnatural speed, grew louder. The brush crackled, branches snapped. I couldn't tell if it was the thing from before or something else. My mind was foggy with fear, but I kept running. My only thought was to get out of the woods, to get somewhere, anywhere that felt safe. The trail began to widen as I neared the edge of the forest, and I saw the light filtering through the trees ahead. I wasn't far from the parking lot now, I realized. My chest heaved as I burst into the open, not daring to look back. The sound of pursuit faded, but I didn't slow down. I didn't stop until I was back at my car, the engine running before I even fully sat down. I slammed the door shut, my hands shaking. I looked around, half expecting to see the figure in the trees, but there was nothing. The parking lot was empty, silent. The woods, though, those woods felt different now, darker. I couldn't explain what had happened, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. All I knew was that I had seen something I shouldn't have, something that didn't belong. As I drove away, the fog still clung to the trees behind me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there was still watching, still waiting. I decided to take a hike alone that Saturday morning. I had been working nonstop for weeks, and the idea of a solo trek through the dense woods was exactly what I needed to clear my head. It was early fall 2024, and I was 31 years old. My name is Jason, and I lived in a small town in the northeastern United States. The weather was mild, the sun peeking out from behind scattered clouds, perfect for a hike. I was looking forward to getting out of town and away from the usual noise. The trail I chose wasn't too far from where I lived, about a 40-minute drive up into the mountains. It was a popular spot for hikers, but it wasn't heavily trafficked either. People came for the views, the tranquility. That's what I was after, too. I parked my truck at the trailhead, grabbed my backpack, and started walking. The first mile was easy. The trail was well marked, lined with tall trees whose leaves were just beginning to change color. The ground was soft underfoot, covered with a mix of dirt and fallen leaves. Birds were chirping overhead, and the occasional rustle of animals in the brush reminded me that I wasn't completely alone. But the solitude was what I craved, so I pushed on. As I moved deeper into the woods, the trail narrowed. The trees grew closer together, casting long shadows even though it was still morning. I wasn't concerned. I had hiked here a few times before and knew my way around. It wasn't a difficult path, just a few twists and turns, with a steady incline leading to a small, secluded lake. After a while, the sounds of wildlife became less frequent, replaced by the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt. The air felt cooler now, almost damp. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath, wiping the sweat from my brow. I didn't see anyone else on the trail so far, which wasn't unusual, but it still felt oddly quiet. Almost too quiet. I took a swig from my water bottle and resumed walking, the feeling of being watched creeping into the back of my mind. It wasn't anything specific, just an instinctual awareness, a feeling of something off. I pushed the thought aside, focusing on the path ahead. The trail bent sharply to the left, and as I rounded the corner, I spotted him. At first, I didn't quite register who or what he was. He stood about 20 yards away, halfway up a small rise in the trail, just beyond a cluster of trees. His back was to me. He was tall, dressed in dark, weathered clothes. His hat, too big for his head, was pulled low, casting his face in shadow. For a split second, I thought he might be another hiker like me, just taking a rest or enjoying the view. But something didn't sit right. The way he stood so still, as if he hadn't moved in a while, was unsettling. I couldn't see his face clearly, but his posture was odd. His shoulders were hunched, and his body language just felt off. It was as if he didn't belong there. I called out a simple "hey," not wanting to seem rude but unsure of how to approach him. No response. He didn't move an inch. I tried again, louder this time, but he still didn't react. I felt my pulse quicken. Normally, people on these trails acknowledge each other, even if it's just a wave or a nod. But this guy wasn't acting normal. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My instinct screamed at me to turn around and leave, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. I'd had plenty of solo hikes before, and I'd never had a bad experience. The thought that something could be wrong was in the back of my mind, but I tried to push it down. I started walking again, keeping an eye on the figure ahead. He was still standing there, motionless. The more I looked at him, the more wrong it seemed. I couldn't explain it, but the way he didn't respond to my voice or move at all was unnerving. I was close enough now that I could see the weathered appearance of his clothes. They were old, dirt-streaked, and mismatched, not at all like something someone would wear for a hike. And his boots, they were scuffed, old, and seemed to have been through far more than just a few trails. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just a loner, someone who liked the silence of the woods. Maybe he didn't hear me, but the longer I watched him, the more unsettled I became. There was something about him that didn't fit. And as I stood there, trying to decide what to do, I noticed something else. He wasn't alone. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a second figure. Another man. He appeared suddenly, almost like he had been hiding behind a tree, though I didn't hear him approach. He was dressed similarly, dark, tattered clothes and a large hat, but he was much closer now. This man stood off to the side of the first, his face hidden as well. Panic flared in my chest. I wasn't just seeing one strange man. There were two, and neither of them had acknowledged me. Felt as though they were waiting for something, waiting for me. I knew then I had to leave. I turned quickly, my heart pounding, and started walking briskly down the trail. My mind raced as I moved, thoughts swirling. The sense of danger was unmistakable. These men weren't hikers. They weren't even behaving like people I'd encounter in the woods. I didn't know who they were or what they wanted, but I knew I had to get out of there before they decided to make a move. The path behind me was still eerily silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were following me. I glanced over my shoulder, but I didn't see them. I pushed on, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that gnawed at my gut. The trees blurred past me, the winding trail seeming to stretch longer with every step. I didn't know if I was being followed. I didn't hear footsteps or see shadows moving behind me, but I still couldn't shake the feeling. I quickened my pace, my breath coming faster. The trees were thick now, and I knew I was getting closer to the lake, my destination. When I finally reached the lake, I stopped for a moment to catch my breath. The water was still, the surface reflecting the sky above. It was peaceful here, the kind of quiet I had been looking for when I set out on this hike. But the sense of unease still lingered in my chest. I took a seat on a nearby rock, trying to calm myself. The two men had not appeared on the trail behind me, but I kept looking over my shoulder. I had no idea where they'd gone or what their intentions were, but I couldn't shake the thought that they were still out there, watching. I stayed by the lake for a while, trying to steady my nerves. The silence of the place seemed oppressive now, and every movement in the trees seemed like a threat. But nothing happened. No footsteps. No sign of them. When I finally made the decision to head back, I was careful. I retraced my steps slowly, listening intently for any sound of movement behind me. There was nothing, not even the usual sounds of wildlife. Just the rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. As I neared the point where I had first seen the two men, I took a deep breath, expecting the worst. But when I reached that spot, I saw no sign of them. There were no footprints in the dirt, no broken branches, nothing that would indicate anyone had been there. I couldn't explain it. I didn't know what had happened or who those men were. It wasn't until I got back to my truck and drove down the mountain that I felt like I could breathe again. I don't know what I saw that day, but it wasn't normal. I haven't gone back to that trail since, and I'm not sure I ever will. I remember the day I decided to go hiking like it was yesterday. The sun was just starting to peek over the horizon as I pulled up to the trailhead. It was the kind of morning that hinted at something special, a crispness in the air that made it perfect for a long walk in the woods. I had been looking forward to this for weeks, needing to clear my mind and find some solitude. The hike was supposed to be a simple one. It was a trail I had heard about from a friend who had done it before. He told me it wasn't particularly difficult, just a good trail to get away from the hustle and bustle of daily life. It started at a small parking lot off a quiet, dirt road in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in Tennessee. I had my gear, my water, a map, and the feeling that I was about to experience something calm and peaceful. I wasn't new to hiking, but I was still somewhat cautious. I had a tendency to worry about what could go wrong. My backpack felt a little too heavy, but I figured that was just my mind playing tricks on me. I had all the essentials, snacks, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and a small knife just in case. The hike was supposed to be a day trip, so I wasn't worried about running out of supplies or being caught off guard by anything. The first part of the trail was relatively flat, following the banks of a small creek. The sound of running water was soothing, and the dense trees above created a canopy that kept the sun from fully breaking through. It was quiet, but not unsettling. Birds chirped in the distance, and the rustling of leaves beneath my boots was the only sound I could hear. The trail was narrow and winding, but it was easy to follow, with bright orange markers on the trees that showed the way. As I made my way deeper into the woods, the trail began to climb. The path became steeper, and I had to pay more attention to where I was stepping. I could feel my muscles working harder, but it felt good. I liked the challenge. The air was getting cooler as I ascended, and the woods seemed to grow quieter. The further I went, the more the sounds of the outside world seemed to fade away, replaced by the sound of my own breathing and the occasional snap of a twig beneath my boots. The trees here were taller, their thick trunks rising high above me, and the forest floor was soft with a carpet of fallen pine needles and moss. There was something almost magical about it. This feeling of being alone in a vast, ancient place. I paused for a moment, taking a deep breath and looking around. The sun had fully risen now, and the forest was alive with light and color. But there was also something else, something subtle in the air. A shift in the atmosphere that I couldn't quite place. I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I was being paranoid. I was out here on my own for the first time in a while, so maybe the solitude was getting to me a little. I checked my watch. It had only been about an hour since I started the hike. I still had a ways to go before I reached the summit. But then something caught my eye. It wasn't anything big or dramatic, just a small movement in the corner of my vision. At first, I thought it was just a squirrel or a deer, but when I looked closer, I saw that there was someone else on the trail. The figure was standing about 100 feet away, just beyond the next bend in the path. They were facing away from me, so I couldn't see their face, but the way they stood was strange. Almost too still, like they were waiting for something. I felt a tightness in my chest, a sudden sense of unease creeping in. I didn't know why, but something about that figure felt wrong. It wasn't just the fact that I hadn't seen anyone on the trail up until that point. It was the way they stood there, motionless. I hesitated, wondering if I should keep going or wait to see if they moved. I decided to push forward. I wasn't going to let my nerves get the best of me. But as I took a few more steps, something made me stop. I could hear the sound of footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, like someone was following me. My heart skipped a beat. I turned around quickly, but there was no one there. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. Maybe it was the wind, or just the forest playing tricks on me. It wasn't like I was in immediate danger. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I quickened my pace, trying to push the unease from my mind. But as I rounded the next bend, I saw that the figure was still there, just standing motionless in the middle of the trail. Now they were closer, and I could see more clearly that they were wearing a large, dark jacket and a wide-brimmed hat. It was an odd choice of clothing for a hike, but maybe they had their reasons. I paused again, wondering what I should do. I didn't want to be rude, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to get any closer. The figure remained silent, unmoving, like they didn't even know I was there. I could feel the tension building in my chest. There was a strange, almost oppressive silence in the air now. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the distant calls of birds were gone. It was as if everything had stopped, holding its breath. Finally, I took a step forward, clearing my throat to let the person know I was coming up behind them. But just as I did, they moved. Slowly, deliberately, they turned their head toward me. At that moment, I froze. The figure's face was obscured by the shadow of their hat, but I could see enough to know that something was off. Their skin was unnaturally pale, almost ghostly. Their eyes, when they finally met mine, were dark, too dark, and there was something about them that made my stomach turn. There was no warmth, no recognition, just an eerie emptiness that sent a chill running through me. The figure took a single step toward me, and that was enough to make me panic. I didn't even think. I just turned and started running. I wasn't sure if I was being paranoid or if something really was wrong, but I didn't want to take any chances. The sound of my own footsteps echoed in the silence as I pushed myself harder, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop to look back, but I could feel the weight of the figure's presence just behind me. Every time I thought I might have gained some distance, I heard the faint sound of footsteps following me, matching my pace. It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes before I saw the sign for the trail's halfway point. I made it to the clearing near the creek and could hear the sound of water flowing once again. The peaceful rush of the stream was a welcome contrast to the dread that had built up in my mind. I stumbled to a stop, panting for breath, looking around. There was no one in sight, no figure,
No footsteps.
I told myself that I had overreacted. Maybe it had all been in my head, the isolation, the quiet, the strange way my mind had been playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My hands were shaking as I dug through my backpack for my phone. I had no signal, but it made me feel safer to have it in my hand. I debated turning back. Maybe I should just call it a day, head back to my car and go home. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't leave. I couldn't let whatever it was, whatever I had felt, take that control from me. I took a deep breath and forced myself to move forward. I wasn't going to let fear dictate my every step. And as I made my way down the trail, slowly at first, my confidence returned. There was no one behind me, no strange figure, no footsteps in the distance. Just the sounds of the forest, the birds, the breeze in the trees. By the time I reached the parking lot, I was exhausted but relieved. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the trail. As I opened the door to my car, I felt a strange sense of closure, as if I had left something behind in the woods. And maybe I had. Maybe the forest had reminded me that sometimes the scariest things aren't the ones we can see, but the ones we can't. It wasn't the figure that had haunted me. It was the fear of being alone, of being vulnerable in a place where the rules of the world seemed to disappear. But I made it out, and as I drove home, the sun setting behind me, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back to that trail. Not anytime soon, anyway. It was the kind of trip I had been planning for months. A solo hike through the mountains of the Pacific Northwest. The idea had always intrigued me. Getting away from the noise of everyday life, stepping into nature, and testing my limits. But as I loaded up my backpack with supplies, I had a strange feeling in the pit of my stomach. Something about the hike felt off, but I shook it off. I'd been on enough trails to know the drill. Nothing to worry about. I started the hike early in the morning, just as the sun began to rise, casting soft pink and orange hues across the sky. The cool morning air made my breath visible as I began the trek up a rugged, uneven trail that snaked up the side of Mount Harlan. It was a well-known trail, so I knew it wouldn't be too remote. But something about the way the fog hung low over the trees that morning felt a little eerie. I figured I'd just take it slow, pace myself, and enjoy the silence. The first few hours were peaceful. The only sounds I could hear were the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the occasional rustling of leaves as I brushed past low-hanging branches. The trail, though challenging, was manageable. Steep inclines, sharp turns, and thick woods with old-growth trees, their massive trunks rising like silent giants, towering above me. Every now and then, I'd stop to take in the view. The dense forest stretched endlessly in all directions, with only the distant peaks of the mountain range peeking through the clouds. I'd been hiking for a good 5 hours when the weather started to change. The sun disappeared behind a thick blanket of clouds, and the wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of damp earth. I glanced at my watch. It was just past noon, but the light was dimming as if it were much later in the day. The temperature dropped quickly, and I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders, trying to ignore the feeling of unease that had started to creep in. I knew I was about 2/3 of the way up when I reached a fork in the trail. To the left, the path seemed to wind deeper into the forest, disappearing into a thicket of trees. To the right, the trail hugged the mountainside, giving way to an expansive view of the valley below. I debated for a moment, but the weather had grown colder, and I didn't want to risk getting lost in dense woods. So I turned right, following the narrow trail along the cliff's edge. The further I went, the colder it got. The wind howled through the trees, sending gusts of cold air cutting through my jacket, and the fog began to thicken. Visibility was down to just a few feet, and the trail became harder to see, the path obscured by the mist. I stopped to pull out my map, but as I was studying it, I heard something. A faint sound, almost like a voice carried by the wind. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like someone was calling out, their voice barely rising above the gusts. I froze for a moment, trying to decipher the sound. It was hard to pinpoint where it was coming from, as the wind seemed to swirl around me from every direction. I shook my head. Maybe it was just my imagination, or perhaps it was the wind playing tricks on me. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I tucked the map back into my pocket and started walking again, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling gnawing at me. The fog grew thicker, and the visibility dropped even further. The trail had started to curve downward, heading toward what looked like a small valley nestled between two ridges. I could just make out the shapes of trees ahead, but everything seemed washed out and muted. That's when I saw it. A figure, barely visible through the thick mist, stood at the edge of the trail. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed in what appeared to be dark clothing. He didn't seem to notice me at first, but as I got closer, he turned slowly, his eyes meeting mine. His gaze was cold, lifeless, sent a chill down my spine. I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing. I hadn't seen anyone on this trail the entire day, so the appearance of this man was strange. I wasn't sure if he was a hiker like me, but something about the way he stood there, motionless, unsettled me. I couldn't explain it, but my instincts told me something was wrong. Without thinking, I quickly turned around and started heading back up the trail, my pulse pounding in my ears. But just as I took a few steps, I heard the soft crunch of footsteps behind me. I stopped again, heart in my throat. I didn't want to turn around, but I had to know if he was following me. I slowly glanced over my shoulder. The man was still there, only now he was a little closer, standing at the edge of the trail with his head slightly tilted to one side. He hadn't moved much, but the way he stared at me made my stomach twist. I knew I had to keep moving. I turned and broke into a jog, my legs aching from the steep incline, but I couldn't stop. I could feel his presence behind me, like a shadow I couldn't escape. The fog was closing in, and the air was thick with the smell of wet earth and pine. The sound of my breath and the pounding of my heart were the only things I could hear as I pushed myself up the hill. I glanced back once more, but I saw nothing. The man was gone. I reached the top of the hill and stopped, gasping for air. I could feel the sweat on my forehead, despite the cold, and my mind raced. Was he just another hiker, or had I imagined the whole thing? I didn't know, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I checked my map again, desperate to get my bearings. I could still hear the wind howling, the fog swirling around me. The valley below seemed to beckon, but something told me I should turn back. I had no idea how far I'd gone, and I was starting to feel disoriented. I decided to head back down the trail. I retraced my steps, trying to stay calm, but the silence was deafening. My ears rang, and every step I took seemed to echo in the stillness. The trail felt different on the way back. The fog was thicker now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every few moments, I'd turn around, but the trail behind me was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. Eventually, after what felt like hours, I came across a small clearing. I paused for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts. That's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure was standing at the far end of the clearing, just beyond the trees. The same man. His posture was exactly the same, frozen, watching me from a distance. This time, I didn't hesitate. My legs moved before I could think, and I sprinted down the trail with everything I had. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pushed myself harder, willing my body to keep moving. I didn't know if the man was following me again, but I couldn't risk it. The trail seemed endless, the trees around me blurring as I ran, my feet pounding the earth. I didn't stop, even when I heard the crunching of footsteps behind me once more. They were closer this time, faster. Just when I thought I couldn't run anymore, I saw it. An opening ahead, the end of the trail, a small parking lot with a few cars. I surged forward, my legs burning with exhaustion, and didn't stop until I reached the lot. I glanced back, my chest heaving, but the man wasn't there. There was no one following me. The trail was silent. I collapsed on a bench, trying to catch my breath, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't just escaped from a random hiker. It wasn't just a bad encounter. Something about that man, his stillness, his presence, felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. But I was safe now. I had made it. I had outpaced whatever it was that had been chasing me. The hike was over, and I would never come back to this trail again. It was the end of September when I decided to take a solo hiking trip through the northern woods of Wyoming. The leaves had started to turn, shades of orange and red lighting up the forest like a painting, and I figured I could use the time alone. Just me, my backpack, and the outdoors. There was something freeing about it. I had done hikes before, nothing too crazy, but this trail was one I'd heard about from a guy at the local outdoor store. It was supposed to be quiet, untouched. No tourists. Perfect for a peaceful getaway. He warned me it could get a little isolated, but that was exactly what I was looking for. The trailhead was on a back road off the highway, hidden behind a line of dense trees. I parked my truck at the small gravel lot, got my gear ready, and set off just as the sun started to dip behind the peaks. The temperature was comfortable, around 60 degrees, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky, the kind of evening that made you think everything was going to be fine. The path was narrow, the soil soft and slightly damp from the previous day's rain. As I walked, I could hear nothing but the sound of my boots crunching against the dirt and the occasional rustling of leaves. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, like the forest was holding its breath. I spent the first couple of hours lost in my thoughts, just breathing in the fresh air and letting my mind wander. The trail zigzagged through thick trees, up and down small ridges before reaching a stream. I paused for a moment, leaned against a large rock by the water, and pulled out my map to check my progress. The forest was dense here, the trees tightly packed. Even though it was still light out, I could already feel a sort of unease creeping over me. There was a stillness to this place that made it feel off, like something wasn't quite right. After a short break, I pushed forward, knowing I had another 3 or 4 miles before I'd set up camp. The trail was supposed to split into a few different directions, and I planned on picking one of the more secluded campsites further north. I didn't mind the extra hike. I wanted the solitude. As I continued, I started to feel like I wasn't alone. There's a way the forest can make you feel like that, like eyes are on you watching from between the trees. It wasn't until I came across an old, abandoned cabin hidden deeper in the woods that the feeling really settled in. The cabin was weathered, with a few broken windows and a collapsed roof. It wasn't on any of the maps, but it wasn't surprising. This area had been neglected for years. The sight of it unsettled me, not because of its condition, but because it felt like it had been left there on purpose, like someone didn't want anyone to find it. I glanced around, scanning the trees behind me. There was nothing, no sign of movement, yet that feeling, that sense of being watched, was still there. I kept going, shaking off the odd thought. The sun was setting now, painting the sky with pinks and purples, and I had to keep moving if I wanted to get to my campsite before dark. The trail twisted again, leading me up a small hill. As I crested it, I saw the last section of the trail ahead of me, a steep descent into a valley. I was about to make my way down when I saw something unusual in the distance. A figure standing at the bottom of the hill, at the edge of the trees. For a moment, I thought it was another hiker, but there was something strange about the way they were standing. Too still, too quiet. I froze, trying to make out any details. The figure was wearing dark clothes, too dark for the fading light, and they stood perfectly still, like they were waiting for something. Maybe waiting for me. I called out, thinking it was just a fellow hiker, but no response. I tried again, this time louder. Still nothing. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and the sense of unease grew stronger. I wanted to call out again, but something stopped me. Instead, I slowly started backing up, stepping carefully as I moved. My heart pounded, and the silence of the woods seemed to close in around me. It felt like every sound, every movement was being amplified. My breath was the loudest thing I could hear. I kept my eyes on the figure as I retreated up the hill. As I did, I could swear I saw them twitch, just a slight movement in the shadows. It wasn't natural. The figure was wrong. I couldn't explain why, but I knew I needed to get out of there. I turned around and began walking faster, trying to keep my pace steady despite the growing panic. The path ahead was dimming, the last light of day fading. I had to get to the campsite, but the idea of being anywhere near that person or whatever it was unbearable. I didn't hear any footsteps behind me, but I didn't take any chances. Every crack of a twig, every rustling leaf made me jump. It felt like the entire forest was closing in, like the trees themselves were watching. And that figure, was it following me? Or was I just imagining it? By the time I reached the campsite, the forest was nearly dark. I threw my gear down and hastily set up my tent, my hands shaking as I worked. The fire pit was empty, the area around it cold and silent. I didn't feel like making a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. Instead, I huddled inside the tent, my flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. The minutes ticked by, each one slower than the last. I tried to relax, tried to convince myself that I had been overreacting, that the figure was just another hiker who had decided to camp nearby. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The night wore on and the temperature dropped. The silence outside was suffocating, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. I couldn't sleep, not with that nagging sense of danger creeping in again. Around midnight, I heard something. It was faint at first, a soft noise that I couldn't quite place. But then it became clearer. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, like someone was walking around the campsite. I froze, barely breathing, trying to listen. The footsteps weren't heavy like a bear or deer. No, these were human footsteps. I was sure of it. I held my breath and listened harder, the sound of the footsteps growing closer. Whoever it was moving deliberately, stepping lightly but with a purpose. Then came the sound of something scraping against the side of my tent. Panic surged through me. I scrambled for my knife, the only weapon I had, and gripped it tightly. My heart pounded in my chest, almost deafening in the silence. The scraping stopped. I could feel my breath catch in my throat, and the world outside my tent seemed to hold its breath with me. Then, through the thin walls of my tent, I heard a voice. It was low and gruff, and it sent a chill through my bones. "Don't run." The words sent a jolt of terror through me. I didn't move. I didn't dare to. The voice wasn't familiar, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. It didn't sound like anyone I'd met. It was wrong. The tone was cold, calculated. I pressed my back against the tent wall, trying to keep my breathing quiet, my body stiff with fear. I thought about running, but where could I go? There was no way out. The forest was vast, and I was miles from civilization. My truck was parked on the other side of the trailhead, but there was no way I could make it there now without being seen. Then the footsteps started moving again, slowly, deliberately. They circled my tent, each step calculated, like the person knew exactly where I was. I could hear them breathing, a faint rasp in the cold night air. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the footsteps stopped. Everything went silent again. I didn't dare make a sound. Minutes passed, and I finally gathered the courage to peer out of the tent's small opening. There was nothing. The area around my camp was still and empty, but I knew someone was out there, and they weren't just watching me. They were waiting. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening to every noise, every rustle. I don't know when, but at some point, the footsteps stopped. I never saw whoever it was again. The silence in the morning felt just as heavy, the forest just as oppressive. When I packed up and left, I didn't look back. I didn't take the trail I'd originally planned to follow. I cut across through thick woods, keeping an eye on my surroundings, always feeling like something was just behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the road. The moment I got to my truck, I didn't even hesitate. I jumped in, started the engine, and drove. And when I looked back in the rearview mirror, I saw nothing but the empty forest stretching out behind me. But I knew I'd been followed, and someone had been waiting. It was supposed to be a simple hike, a weekend trip into the woods, just to escape the grind of the city. I hadn't been on a serious hike in years, but my friend Noah, who'd always been the more outdoorsy type, convinced me to join him. He had planned the whole thing, picking a trail deep in the mountains, far from the usual touristy spots, the kind of place where you could really disconnect from everything. He said it was a perfect way to unwind, get some fresh air, and do something challenging. I wasn't exactly thrilled by the idea of leaving my comfort zone, but Noah had always been the kind of guy who made things sound easy, even when they weren't. So I packed my bag with basic hiking gear: a water bottle, a flashlight, some snacks, and my phone, which I hoped I wouldn't need but brought just in case. We drove out early that morning, the sun barely peeking over the horizon as we left the city behind. The ride was smooth for the most part, with the occasional stretch of winding road that made me feel a bit uneasy, especially when we passed through forests so thick you could barely see the sky above. After about 3 hours, we reached the trailhead. It wasn't marked on most maps, which made it feel more like a hidden gem than a popular hike. Noah, being the experienced hiker, was already excited to get going, adjusting his backpack and checking his gear while I tried to gather my thoughts. I was no expert, but I had done my share of walking and day trips, so I thought I'd be fine. Still, there was something off about the place. The woods felt too quiet. No chirping birds, no rustling leaves, just stillness. It was unsettling. The trail itself was narrow and overgrown in parts, with tall trees pressing in on either side. As we started our hike, the sound of our boots crunching on the dirt was the only noise that broke the silence. The sun was still low in the sky, casting long shadows over the path, but it was getting warmer as the morning wore on. For the first few hours, everything went smoothly. The air was crisp, and I could smell the earth, the pine, and the distant scent of something floral. We stopped every so often to catch our breath and have a snack. Noah talked about different plants and animals along the way, showing me things I'd never noticed. It was actually kind of nice, despite the uneasy feeling I couldn't shake. Maybe I was just overthinking it. Around midday, after we'd crossed a small stream and started climbing a steeper incline, something changed. I felt it before I saw it. A heaviness in the air. The forest, which had been so still before, now felt oppressive. The temperature dropped slightly, and there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, like the whole place was holding its breath. Noah seemed to notice it too, but he didn't say anything. He just kept walking, eyes forward, his usual upbeat attitude gone. We kept moving, pushing ourselves through the increasingly difficult terrain. The trail started to twist and wind, the trees growing thicker and more densely packed together. There were fewer signs of any wildlife now, no birds, no insects. It felt like we were in a place untouched by time, the world outside this forest not even existing anymore. At one point, Noah stopped and pointed out a trail marker, a faded piece of plastic tied to a tree, but there was something strange about it. It was old, almost weathered beyond recognition, and there was something about the way it had been placed, like it hadn't been touched in years. At that moment, I felt my stomach tighten. Something didn't feel right. We continued on for another hour, the trail becoming less and less defined. The terrain was rougher now, with rocks and roots jutting out of the ground. My feet were starting to ache, and I could tell Noah was getting tired too. He'd been leading the way, but now he was moving slower, his eyes scanning the trees ahead. We reached a small clearing, and Noah stopped. He pulled out a map, staring at it for a moment, then looked up at the sky. The light was beginning to fade, casting a soft orange glow across the landscape. I could see the exhaustion in his face now. He usually had boundless energy, but the fatigue was starting to show. "I think we should set up camp here," he said, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "It's getting late, and we're not exactly sure how much further the trail goes. Better to be safe than sorry." I agreed. I wasn't eager to push further, especially with the way the atmosphere had changed. There was a strange feeling that had settled over me, like we were being watched. Noah started gathering firewood, and I helped him. As I bent down to pick up a few branches, I heard a faint noise, barely noticeable at first, a rustling in the trees. I froze, my heart racing. It was far off, maybe a few hundred yards, but it sounded wrong, too deliberate, too close. I glanced at Noah, but he didn't seem to hear it. I felt a sense of unease in my gut, the kind that makes your skin crawl. We set up the tent and lit a fire, the crackling flames breaking the silence around us. I tried to push the strange feeling out of my mind, but it kept nagging at me. Every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of movement in the trees, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Night fell quickly, and the forest seemed to close in around us. The firelight danced and flickered, casting eerie shadows on the trees. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something standing just outside the reach of the fire. But nothing appeared. Still, the sensation that we were not alone grew stronger. After a while, Noah sat down beside the fire, rubbing his eyes. "I'm going to sleep early tonight," he said, his voice hoarse. "We can start fresh in the morning." I nodded, though I didn't feel like sleeping. My mind was racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching us. The night dragged on. I stayed awake, staring into the flames, hearing the occasional snap of a branch in the distance. It was getting harder to ignore the sense that something or someone was lurking in the shadows. Around midnight, I heard it again, that rustling, closer this time. I shot up from my seat, my heart pounding in my chest. I scanned the trees, my eyes straining in the darkness. There was nothing. I told myself it was just the wind, but deep down I knew it wasn't. Noah was asleep, snoring lightly beside the fire. I should have woken him, but I didn't. I didn't want to sound paranoid. I didn't want to scare him. Instead, I kept my eyes trained on the dark edges of the clearing, waiting for any sign of movement. An hour passed. The noise stopped, but the unease remained, thicker than before. Finally, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight, my hand trembling, and stepped out of the tent. The air felt cold now, the kind of cold that sinks deep into your bones. I shined the light around the clearing, but everything was still. The fire had burned low, casting long, stretching shadows. But there was no movement. No one was there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. Something was off. I turned around to head back to the tent, but as I did, I froze. I thought I saw something, just at the edge of the light, a figure, It was tall, impossibly tall, standing still in the dark just beyond the clearing. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its presence. It was watching me, and for a moment, I thought my heart might stop beating. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. I didn't wait another second. I rushed back to the tent, zipped it up, and huddled inside, my chest tight with fear. I didn't dare to look outside again. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I barely slept, my mind spinning with thoughts of that figure. What had I seen? Was it just my mind playing tricks on me? Or was something actually out there? When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I felt a strange sense of relief. We packed up quickly, both of us eager to leave the forest behind. The hike back was quiet. The same unsettling silence clung to the air, but this time, I didn't care. I just wanted to get out. By the time we reached the car, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The road back to the city never looked so good. We didn't talk much on the drive home, both of us lost in our own thoughts. But I could tell Noah had felt it too. Whatever was out there in those woods, we'd both felt it. When I got home, I found myself checking over my shoulder more often than usual. The woods had left their mark on me. The stillness, the shadows, the feeling of being watched. I would never forget it. I didn't go hiking again for a long time after that. The rain started that morning, just as I was packing up my gear. It wasn't expected. The weather forecast had been clear, but as I zipped up my bag, I could feel the moisture in the air. I had been planning this hiking trip for months, an escape from the busy city, a few days in the mountains to clear my head. Alone, I needed that. I had chosen the Willow Creek Trail, a remote path tucked deep into the North Cascade Range in Washington. The place was known for its serene beauty, dense forests, and rugged cliffs, but also for its isolation. Not many hikers ventured this far out anymore. Most were put off by the heavy rain season, and others just found it too tough. It wasn't a tourist trap, that's for sure. I parked my car at the trailhead around noon, under a cloudy sky. The trees around me were thick, their branches heavy with rain from the previous night. The ground was wet and slick, and my boots made soft squelching sounds as I moved down the path. The trail started easy enough, a well-maintained path that wound through tall pines and thick underbrush. The smell of wet earth mixed with pine resin, a scent I always found comforting. The first couple of hours went by without incident. The trail was quiet. The only sounds were the rustling leaves above and the occasional drip of water falling from branches. I took my time, stopping now and then to catch my breath, take in the scenery, and check the map. By late afternoon, the clouds had thickened. The wind picked up, and the rain became heavier, but I was prepared. I had a rain jacket, extra layers, and a sturdy tent set to be set up when I found a good spot. I was already a few miles in, and I figured I could make it to the next shelter by nightfall. That's when I noticed something odd. It started as a shadow in the trees. At first, I thought it was just the low light or perhaps my eyes playing tricks on me. But after a few minutes of walking, I caught a glimpse again. It was moving. Not much, just a slight shift behind a group of thick pines, as if someone was ducking out of view. I stopped. My heart rate picked up a bit. I hadn't seen another hiker all day. I didn't feel threatened, but I did feel uneasy. The trail wasn't that wide, and if someone had been close enough to move like that, they would have heard me. I shook my head, dismissing it as my imagination running wild, the rain and the isolation messing with my mind. I continued walking, but the uneasy feeling lingered. The deeper I went into the forest, the more isolated I felt. I couldn't hear any birds or animals anymore, just the rustling of the wind and the constant thrum of rain. The trees seemed taller here, and the shadows stretched longer. I glanced at my watch. It was almost 6, and the light was beginning to fade. I picked up my pace, hoping to make it to the shelter before it got too dark. As I neared a clearing, I saw it. There, at the far edge of the forest, stood a figure. A person standing still, half hidden by the trees. I froze. The figure didn't move. It was just there. The hood of their jacket was pulled low over their face, and they stood with their back to me. I stood there for a few long seconds, waiting, not sure what to do. The rain poured down, but the air was oddly still. "Hello," I called out, though I immediately regretted it. My voice felt too loud in the stillness of the forest. The figure didn't respond. They just stood there, unmoving. My gut told me to turn around and leave, but I fought it. Maybe it was just another hiker, a lone traveler like me, out here in the rain. I took a step forward. Still nothing. No movement, no sound. My heart was pounding now. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Another step. This time, I called out again, louder. "Are you okay?" There was a sudden rustle in the bushes, and then the figure was gone. Vanished. 1 second they were there, and the next there was nothing but rain and trees. I couldn't move. My mind raced. Had they seen me? Had they been waiting for me to get closer? I looked around frantically, my breath shallow. I stood there for what felt like hours, though it was probably just a few minutes. The rain kept falling, and the silence pressed in. Then I made the decision to turn around. There was no point in pushing forward. It wasn't safe. Whatever I had seen, whatever that person was, had spooked me enough. I had no business being out here alone anymore. I retraced my steps, my pace quickening as the light faded further. The forest around me felt different now, more oppressive. The shadows seemed deeper. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I neared a bend in the trail, I heard something. Footsteps, light and careful. Someone was following me. I stopped dead in my tracks, listening hard. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I took a step back, hoping to get a glimpse of whoever it was. Nothing. The path ahead was clear, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I kept moving, quicker now, trying to push past the fear, trying to ignore the thoughts running through my head. I was alone in the middle of nowhere. There was no one around for miles. My mind was making connections, none of them good. I kept telling myself it was nothing, but the fear was getting harder to ignore. The sky darkened fully, and the rain didn't let up. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, my eyes darting to the woods on either side. I didn't know how much longer I could keep this up. The trail was getting rougher, and I wasn't sure how much farther the shelter was. My legs were already sore from the long hike, and the added fear of someone stalking me was draining me faster than I expected. Then I saw it, the small wooden shelter, barely visible through the trees. I felt a surge of relief. It wasn't much, just a small structure with a tin roof, but it would be enough to get me out of the rain. I ran toward it, desperate for some sort of safety. But as I reached the door, something caught my eye. Movement, just outside the shelter. The figure, standing there, half hidden by the rain. I froze. The figure hadn't been there a second ago. I hadn't heard them approach. My chest tightened. I looked around. There was no way out. The shelter had one door and no windows to speak of. The trees were too thick to run through. My only choice was to confront this person. I grabbed the door handle, turned it, and stepped inside. There was no one there. I was alone. The shelter smelled of damp wood and stale air, the fire pit in the center cold and empty. I closed the door quickly behind me and bolted it shut. I leaned against the wall, breathing heavily, trying to calm my racing heart. The rain pounded against the roof, and the wind howled through the cracks in the walls. But I was safe, I thought, at least for now. I spent the rest of the night inside, too scared to sleep. My mind raced with thoughts of what had happened. I couldn't shake the image of the figure, standing in the rain, just watching. Had they been following me the entire time? Why hadn't they approached me earlier? Why did they stay so far away? By morning, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. I knew I had to get out of there. I packed my things quickly, not wanting to stay in the shelter a moment longer. The fear still lingered, but I forced myself to focus. I had to keep moving. As I made my way back down the trail, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days. It felt like a blessing, the warmth of the light slowly calming my nerves. I didn't see the figure again. I didn't hear any more footsteps. I made it back to the trailhead without incident, and when I saw my car waiting for me, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of relief. I never went hiking in that area again. And to this day, I still don't know who that person was or what they wanted. But one thing I learned on that trip, sometimes it's better not to know. I remember the day I set out on the hike through the Amazon rainforest like it was yesterday. The air was thick, sticky, and heavy with the smell of wet earth and decaying plant life. The heat was relentless. I had been preparing for this trip for months, having finally convinced myself that I could handle it. An adventure that promised to be the ultimate test of endurance and willpower. The year was 2023. I was 32 years old, and though I'd done my share of hiking, this was something far beyond the trails in national parks or the mile treks I'd done in the Rockies. The Amazon was an entirely different beast. I was going in with the goal of seeing the wild side of the world, capturing moments through my camera and soaking in the raw beauty of one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. I had a guide, Raul, a man in his 40s who had grown up in the jungle. He was lean, his skin dark and leathery from years under the sun. He had a quiet confidence that put me at ease, at least at first. His knowledge of the jungle seemed to be second nature, as though he could sense every rustle in the leaves, every subtle shift in the wind. The plan was simple. We would be out for about a week, trekking from a small research station near the river deep into the heart of the jungle, where few people ever ventured. The area wasn't exactly untouched by humans, but it had been some time since anyone had been in there. That's why Raul and I had been chosen. My camera gear and his expertise were a perfect match for the research project. We weren't alone, though. There were a couple of others who had been around the research station, but I hadn't met them yet. They would be catching up with us later. The first couple of days were physically demanding but manageable. The jungle didn't let up, and the heat gnawed at my skin. We moved carefully, following narrow trails that were sometimes just barely wide enough for us to pass through. There was a constant hum in the air, chirping insects, distant animal calls, the rustling of unseen creatures. There was a moment when I thought I heard something move in the bushes beside us, but when I looked, nothing was there. I shrugged it off. I was starting to get used to the idea that the Amazon was alive in ways I couldn't fully understand. The nights were the worst. When the sun dipped below the horizon, the jungle transformed. The sounds of the day faded into something deeper, more primal. We set up camp beneath a giant tree that had roots like tendrils, reaching deep into the earth. The ground was uneven, covered in thick, damp leaves. I could feel the weight of the jungle pressing in on me from every direction. Every sound was magnified in the darkness. The snap of a twig, the croak of a distant frog, the unsettling rustle of leaves that I couldn't quite place. I tried to focus on the stars above. There was something calming about them, though even that felt distant, like the sky itself was holding its breath. Raul didn't seem bothered by the noise. He was a man of few words, and when he did speak, it was often about the jungle, its plants, its animals, its dangers. At night, he would sit by the fire and tell me about the things to avoid. Certain plants that could kill you with a single touch, snakes that blended in so well with the environment that you'd never see them until it was too late. And always there were the jaguars. "Don't worry about the jaguars," he said once, his voice low and measured. "They won't bother you unless they feel threatened." It was the first time I had ever heard someone speak of jaguars so casually. But then again, Raoul had spent his whole life around them. By the third day, I was beginning to notice things. Little things at first. We had crossed a shallow stream, and I saw something strange. Footprints in the mud, large ones. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light or maybe an animal's prints. But they were too human-shaped. The size, the way the toes were imprinted in the mud, it was unmistakable. I showed Raoul, but he didn't seem concerned. "It's probably just someone else," he said dismissively. "This is not an unvisited place, you know?" I had my doubts, but I didn't press him. What else could I do? The tracks weren't recent, but something about them unsettled me. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't the only ones out here. The feeling grew worse as we pushed deeper into the jungle. By the fourth day, the thick trees began to thin, and we found ourselves navigating through dense underbrush and muddy, slippery ground. I had to keep my eyes on my footing, the trail barely visible in some areas. Every now and then, Raoul would stop, his head tilting slightly as though listening for something, but he never said anything. His eyes, though, seemed sharper, like he was watching the surroundings with an intensity one couldn't fully comprehend. That night, things started to change. The air was heavy, charged with an electric tension that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Raoul seemed to sense it too, but he didn't say a word. We set up camp earlier than usual, the fire crackling, the smell of burning wood filling the air. The jungle around us felt off, like something was wrong. I tried to push the unease aside, telling myself I was just tired. But then, as I sat by the fire, I noticed something strange. Movement just outside the light's reach. I froze. For a second, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, but the movement was real. Something or someone was standing just beyond the edge of the firelight, barely visible in the shadows. It wasn't the usual rustling of an animal. This was deliberate, slow, almost like it was watching us. Raoul stood up suddenly, his face tense. He didn't say anything, but I saw him grab his machete from the ground and move toward the trees. I wanted to call out to him, but my voice wouldn't come. The fire crackled and popped, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. I stood up, my legs shaking, and took a step toward the tree line. But just as quickly, Raoul returned, his machete still in hand, his expression unreadable. "There's nothing out there," he said, his voice low but firm. I wanted to believe him, but something deep inside me told me that whatever had been watching us was still out there. And I couldn't shake the thought that it wasn't an animal. It was something far worse. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Every sound, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves, kept me on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being hunted, though I couldn't tell by what. The next day, the feeling grew stronger. The jungle felt quieter somehow, and I kept seeing those strange, large footprints. The air had grown thick, suffocating, as though the entire forest was holding its breath. And then we stumbled upon the camp. At first, I thought it was ours. It looked familiar, like something we had passed earlier. But when I took a closer look, I realized it wasn't. It was a small clearing, a pile of broken branches and a few discarded items. There were no signs of life, but the way everything was arranged was wrong. It looked disturbed, like someone or something had been here recently. I motioned to Raoul, but he was already shaking his head. His face was tight, and his eyes darted around, as though expecting something to emerge from the jungle at any moment. He grabbed my arm and pulled me away from the sight, urgency in his movements. "We need to move," he said quickly. "Now." I didn't ask any questions. I followed him as he led the way, the jungle closing in around us, the path becoming harder to follow. The rest of the day passed in a blur. We made little progress, and by dusk, the jungle seemed to close around us completely. The feeling of being watched had only intensified. The quiet, the stillness, something wasn't right. And then we heard it. A soft, distant sound. A hum like someone singing. It was faint, barely audible above the natural sounds of the jungle, but it was unmistakable. Raoul stopped in his tracks, his body rigid. I turned to him, but he didn't look at me. Instead, he was scanning the darkness, his eyes wide with fear. He grabbed me, pulling me behind a thick tree trunk. "You need to stay here," he whispered urgently. "Stay silent. Do not move." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. Whatever was out there, it was close now. Too close. Raoul crept forward, moving soundlessly through the underbrush. I watched him disappear into the darkness, my breath shallow as I strained my ears to listen. The humming grew louder, clearer. It wasn't human. It was something wrong. I don't know how long I sat there, my heart hammering in my chest. It felt like an eternity before Raoul returned, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. I could see it in his eyes. We didn't speak a word as we made our way back. We didn't camp that night. We walked and we kept walking until we found the first signs of civilization. It was another day before I fully understood what had happened. Raoul had refused to talk, but I had pieced it together. We had been hunted by a man. The rest of the story is hazy, and I can't speak of it in full detail. Raoul's silence spoke volumes, but we made it out, and I learned that not everything in the jungle is an animal. Some things wear human skin, and they are far worse than anything the wild could offer. It's been over a year since I lost Sarah. Sometimes it feels like just yesterday, and other times it feels like a lifetime ago. The pain of losing her is still raw, but I'm trying to find ways to keep going. I don't know what made me think that hiking would help, but there I was, standing at the trailhead at the edge of the forest, the cold mountain air biting at my skin. I used to take Sarah hiking all the time. We loved the quiet, the way the world seemed to fade away as we trekked through the trees. She had always been more of a nature lover than I was, but I loved seeing the joy in her face when we were out there, away from the distractions of everyday life. Today, though, it was different. She wasn't beside me, and I was out here on my own. I needed to prove to myself that I could handle being out here without her. I needed to find some kind of peace, some sense of normalcy, even if it was just for a few hours. I looked up at the mountain trail that wound through the forest and narrowed my eyes against the rising sun. The trail was well marked, though I knew it would soon become more rugged the further I went. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, my boots crunching on the frost-covered earth. The first few steps felt almost comforting, the crunch of my feet in sync with the beating of my heart. It wasn't long before the trees began to close in around me. The forest was dense, the branches above so thick that they blocked out most of the sunlight. I could hear the occasional bird call, but otherwise it was eerily quiet. Too quiet. I paused for a moment, taking in the stillness. Something felt off. It wasn't like the usual peace I'd come to expect from a forest. I shook my head. My nerves were probably just heightened. It had been a while since I'd hiked alone, and the solitude was messing with my mind. I forced myself to keep moving. As I trekked deeper into the forest, the air grew colder, and a light fog began to settle in. It curled around the trunks of the trees, making everything look blurry and distant. The trail seemed to go on forever, winding through the trees and climbing higher as the mountain began to rise sharply ahead. I wasn't sure how far I wanted to go today. I hadn't planned on a long hike. My goal was just to get out and feel like I could still do something on my own. That's when I heard it. A noise, a rustling. I froze. It was coming from somewhere ahead of me, off the trail, but the trees were so thick that I couldn't see past them. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The sound stopped, leaving only silence in its wake. I stood there, trying to convince myself it was just an animal, probably a deer or maybe a bear. The forest was full of wildlife. There was no reason to panic, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I took a cautious step forward, my eyes scanning the trees. The rustling had been to my left, so I veered slightly off the trail, moving in that direction. My heart began to pound faster with every step, and then I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the tree line. It was a man, tall, maybe in his late 40s or early 50s, wearing a dark jacket and a thick pair of pants. He was standing completely still, as if he were waiting for something, or someone. I didn't know what to do. I had no idea how long he had been standing there, how long he had been watching me. I took another step, trying to gauge his reaction. His face was obscured by a dark hood, but I could see his eyes, cold, unsettling eyes that didn't seem to blink. I didn't want to make a sound. I didn't want to startle him or make him think I was a threat. But at the same time, I felt an instinctive urge to get away, to put distance between us. I slowly turned back toward the trail, my eyes never leaving him. That's when he moved. Not quickly. He didn't charge at me or anything like that, but there was something deliberate in his movements. He didn't step out from the trees. Instead, he just seemed to melt into the shadows. I couldn't explain it. One moment he was there, and the next he was gone. I blinked, wondering if I had imagined the whole thing. The fog was thickening now, and the trail was becoming harder to see. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. My instincts were telling me to turn back, to leave. But I wasn't sure if it was fear or just the weight of everything I'd been carrying with me since Sarah died. Maybe I was just overreacting. Maybe it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the unease. I decided to press on, but I kept my eyes darting between the trees, watching for any sign of movement. The wind picked up, making the branches sway and creak, and the fog thickened, obscuring the trail in front of me. As I walked, the sound of something snapping twigs behind me reached my ears. I stopped. I wasn't alone. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the area behind me. Nothing. I waited, and then I heard it again. A twig snapping underfoot, followed by the sound of something else moving through the underbrush. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't alone. I started walking faster, my heart hammering in my chest. But it felt like the sounds were getting closer. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear the footsteps, steady and deliberate, following me. I broke into a jog, pushing myself harder, my legs burning with the effort. The forest around me felt like it was closing in, the fog thickening with every step. My breath came in short gasps as I pushed through the brush, the sound of footsteps still echoing in my ears. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. I stopped running, my chest heaving with exhaustion, my body drenched in sweat. I turned in circles, trying to catch a glimpse of whoever had been following me, but the trees were empty. No one was there. I waited a long time before I started moving again, every step cautious, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of life. But as the minutes passed, I began to wonder if it had all been in my head. Maybe I was just losing my mind. That's when I saw it. A figure standing at the end of the trail. It was the same man. His hood was pulled back now, revealing a gaunt face with a sharp, unnerving smile. He wasn't standing in the shadows anymore. He was right in front of me, blocking my path. I stood frozen, unable to move. The world around me seemed to tilt, the fog swirling, distorting everything. The only thing that was clear was him, his eyes, cold and empty, fixed on me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't find the words. I couldn't make my body obey me. And then, as quickly as it had all started, he was gone. The man vanished into the fog, as if he had never been there at all. I stood there, shaking, my heart pounding in my ears. But I wasn't alone. Not anymore. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring into the thick fog, but eventually, I found the strength to move. I turned around and ran, full sprint, back down the trail. I didn't stop until I reached the bottom of the mountain, my lungs burning and my legs giving out beneath me. When I finally made it back to the trailhead, I looked over my shoulder one last time. Nothing. The forest was silent, the trail empty, but I knew what I'd seen, and I would never be the same again. I made my way back home that day. I don't know if I'll ever hike alone again, but I do know one thing. That day, in the mountains, something had followed me, and it wasn't just my mind playing tricks. Something was out there, something real. It was a crisp October morning, the kind of day where the sun filters through the trees just enough to cast a golden glow on everything, but not warm you up too much. I'd been hiking solo for a few days. The wilderness was my escape, a chance to reset. I was near the Cascade Mountains, a vast expanse of forest, rocky cliffs, and deep ravines. It was the kind of place that drew me in, a spot so far removed from civilization that once you stepped into the woods, you truly felt the isolation. The trail I was on wasn't particularly well known, which is why I liked it. There were no crowds, no tourists, just the sounds of nature. The path I followed curved along a narrow creek, its water trickling over smooth stones. I could hear the soft calls of birds in the distance, the rustling of leaves underfoot, and the occasional snap of a twig. I was in my element. By the time I reached the old lookout tower, I had already been hiking for a solid 6 hours. I'd stopped once or twice for water, but otherwise kept a steady pace. The tower stood in front of me, weathered by time. I always loved this place. There was something peaceful about the sight of it, perched on top of the ridge, almost as if it was keeping watch over the valley below. From up here, you could see miles of thick forest stretching in every direction. No signs of human life, just wilderness as far as the eye could see. I took a deep breath of the cool, pine-scented air and started up the narrow wooden stairs. The structure creaked beneath my weight, a reminder that it had stood here for decades, perhaps longer. When I reached the top, I sat on the edge, letting my legs dangle over the side as I looked out at the view. The valley below was serene, the sun beginning to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the landscape. I wasn't sure how long I'd been sitting there when I noticed something odd, a figure moving through the trees. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but as I focused on it, I realized it was definitely a person. They were walking in the opposite direction of the trail, moving deeper into the forest. It seemed strange because I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail all day, and the figure appeared to be off course, nowhere near any of the established paths. I pulled my pack up and stuffed my water bottle back inside before making my way down from the tower. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow the figure. I wasn't sure why I felt the urge to do so, but something about it tugged at me. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was just the need for company in such a quiet, remote place. The hike down the trail was quick, and I soon found myself at the spot where I had seen the figure. I stood still for a moment, listening. The woods were quiet again, and there was no sign of movement. I took a few more steps, scanning the area carefully. My eyes caught something: footprints. They were fresh, the earth still disturbed. The prints were deep, like the person was carrying a heavy load or perhaps walking with a limp. I followed the tracks as they veered off the main trail, moving further into the trees. The woods grew denser the further I went, the trees standing close together, their branches forming a thick canopy overhead. The light began to dim, and I could hear the faint sounds of animals rustling in the underbrush. It was quiet, but in a way that felt unnerving, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. After another hour of hiking, I came across something that made me stop dead in my tracks. A small campfire, still smoldering. The fire pit was just off to the side of a narrow, overgrown path, and I could see the faint outline of a tent further up. The flames had burned out, but the area still smelled of smoke. I looked around, my heart rate picking up. No one was around. The tent wasn't much, just a basic, faded green shelter, half collapsed as though it hadn't been used in days. There was a trail of gear leading away from it, an abandoned sleeping bag, a broken flashlight, a cracked water bottle. It all looked hastily discarded, as if the person had left in a hurry. I wasn't sure what to make of it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I couldn't quite shake the feeling that someone was still out there. The world around me was silent, almost too silent. I walked carefully over to the camp, inspecting everything I could. It didn't take long for me to realize that the place had been abandoned. There was nothing here that indicated the person had gone anywhere willingly. It all looked as though someone had just disappeared. My thoughts were interrupted by a sound. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was just a deer or another animal, but then I heard it again, closer this time. My pulse quickened. I slowly turned around, scanning the trees. That's when I saw him. He was standing in the shadows, half concealed behind a thick cluster of shrubs, staring directly at me. I couldn't make out his features, but the outline of a man was clear. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a dark jacket that blended in with the forest. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The forest around me felt heavy, oppressive, as though the air itself had thickened. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. The figure stepped out of the shadows, taking a slow, deliberate step toward me. There was something wrong about the way he moved. Too deliberate, too calm. I tried to take a step back, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I could feel my breath catching in my throat, my pulse racing. Every fiber of my being told me to run, but I couldn't seem to make myself move. Finally, the man spoke, though not in words, just a low, guttural sound that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. It wasn't anything I could understand, just a strange noise that seemed to vibrate in the air. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled with a cold, primal fear. I forced myself to break from the trance, taking a cautious step backward. But it wasn't fast enough. The man lunged toward me, closing the distance in what felt like a second. My heart nearly exploded in my chest as I turned and bolted into the trees. The trail ahead was unclear, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away from him. I stumbled over rocks, branches, and roots, barely managing to keep my footing. My breath came in gasps, my heart pounding so loudly in my chest I was sure he could hear it. I kept running, not daring to look back, but knowing deep down that he was following me. I had no idea how long I had been running, but my legs felt like jelly, my muscles burning with every step. The woods were darker now, the canopy blocking out most of the remaining light. It was easy to lose the trail, to lose yourself in the labyrinth of trees and undergrowth. But I couldn't stop, not now. I tripped over something, tumbling down a small incline. My body hit the ground hard, and I gasped for air. I could hear him now, his footsteps too close for comfort. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline pushing me forward. The ground began to slope upward again, and I found myself on a narrow ridge. Ahead, I saw something, a small cabin. It looked like an old hunting shack, abandoned like so many others in this part of the forest. Without thinking, I dashed toward it, throwing open the door and slamming it shut behind me. I didn't care if the place was empty or not. At least the walls might offer some kind of protection. I locked the door and pressed my back against it, listening. The woods were quiet again. Too quiet. I waited for what felt like hours, listening for any sound, any sign that he was out there. But nothing came. I eventually allowed myself to collapse onto the cold wooden floor, my body exhausted, my mind still racing. I had no idea who the man was or why he had been in those woods, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going anywhere until morning. And even then, I would take the long way back to the nearest trailhead. Somewhere in the distance, the wind howled, and I realized just how alone I truly was. But at least for now, I was safe.